Welcome to the grant workshop, everyone. Really quick that I forgot to mention before we hit record. If you don't want to be featured in this recording, be sure to just turn your camera off. We can't guarantee that you won't be featured if your camera is on. All right, moving right along. Who is RISCA? So RISCA, we are a state agency. We're the State Arts Council. We're supported by both appropriations from the Rhode Island General Assembly, so Rhode Island taxpayer funds, as well as funds from the National Endowment for the Arts, the federal agency, so federal taxpayer funds. We provide grants, technical assistance, and staff support to arts and culture organizations, artists, schools, community centers, social service organizations, local governments, et cetera, et cetera. We do grants. That's how many people interface with us, but we're also available to just be here for you all to talk about what's happening arts and culture-wise in Rhode Island, to bounce project ideas that you have off of us, or just wanting to get a sense of what kind of supports we can offer beyond grants for the work that you all do. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Next slide, please. So RISCA awards grants for arts and culture activities in these following program areas: nonprofit organizations. We have grants available to any nonprofit organization doing an arts and culture program. You don't necessarily need to be an arts and culture nonprofit per se. Artists, individual artists, grants in arts education that could be applied for by nonprofits and schools. We'll talk about that more later on. Grants for folk and traditional artists and arts activities, and then grants relating to arts and health and arts and healthcare. The big thing to know, and this is not shocking to many of you, but sometimes it always is shocking to a couple people on these workshops. For everything we do, arts and culture is at the center of it. So we fund arts and culture projects and programs. That's our focus. Next slide, please. So the grants that we have open that we're going to focus on today, the ones that are open for the April 3rd deadline, are project grants for organizations, our project grants in education, our arts and health project grants, Make Art grants for individual artists, community engage project grants for individual artists, and general operating support for organizations. Next slide, please. So we have two deadlines a year always, and they're April 1st or October 1st, except when those days fall on a weekend, in which case they occur on the next business day, which is the case this year. So our April 3rd, 2023 deadline we have coming up is to support projects happening between July 1st of 2023 and June 30th of 2024. And the October 2nd, 2023 deadline will be to support projects occurring between January 1st, 2024 and June 30th of 2024. For any grant that is applied for and received at this deadline, you all, if you receive one, will have a final report due by July 31st of 2024. In some cases, that final report is a combination of a in-person meeting or conversation along with a submitted written final report, depending on the grant program you're applying within. There's more specifics about that within the guidelines for each specific grant program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So this is the RISCA program staff. Not all of us are here today, and we have an additional person who is not featured on the slide here. As I said, my name is Todd Trebor. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I have managed the organization's grant programs, our project grants for organizations, and our general operating support for organizations program. As I mentioned previously, organizations program director, I'm also the 504 accessibility coordinator for our agency, meaning I'm a point person if you have any questions about access or accessibility for either your organizations or just projects that you're doing if you're not associated with an organization. I'm going to popcorn it over to one of my colleagues. I'm going to recommend that for my colleagues, we do that continuing forward. Faye, why don't you introduce yourself? I know you're not featured on here, but we want to be sure everyone knew you in your role as communications director at the agency.
Hi, everybody. I'm the communications director here at RISCA. I'll put my email in the chat for all of you. I am here to help you and support you if I do many things, but if you need to subscribe to the newsletter, I can help you with that. I can help you navigate the website, which can sometimes be a little confusing. And I can answer any questions you have that involve sort of external communications. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to Todd and put my contact information in the chat. Enjoy the workshop, everybody.
Great, thanks, Faye. And Maggie, why don't you go next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Anderson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Arts and Education Director at RISCA. Today, I'll be speaking with you guys about the Project Grants and Education funding opportunity, and I'll kick it over to Anissa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anissa Raouf. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Arts and Health Grants Program Manager. I'll be speaking about the Arts and Health Grants today. I'm also excuse me. I support all the program directors here on the back end. So when it comes to grant awards and processing invoices and things, you might hear from me in other phases around the system. So that's me. I'll pop it over to Molly.
Hello, I'm Molly Flanagan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Individual Artist Program Director, and I oversee a whole bunch of grants, but today I'll be talking about the Community Engaged Project Grants and the Make Arts Grant. And missing today, because she doesn't have any grants open at this cycle, is our colleague Elena Calderon Patino. Feel free to reach out to her. She oversees our Folk and Traditional Arts Grant Program, as well as the Expansion Arts Grant Program. So the next section, we're going to talk really briefly about each of the grants that's open at the April 3rd deadline, and then we'll move on to more workshop-y tips and tricks. So the Community Engaged Project Grant is for artists or individuals working outside the support and structure of a nonprofit or another formal institution. And these are grants of $500 to $3,000 for projects that directly and actively engage Rhode Island residents in making, experiencing, or learning about art. We're really emphasizing sort of two-way interactive learning here, rather than just sort of receiving or watching or viewing. And then the second grant that I have open at this deadline is the Make Art Grant, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's grants of $500 to $3,000 for artists to create or continue a specific artwork in any discipline. Note that the artwork does not have to be completed within the 6-month period. It just has to have specific forward goals. And if you're more curious about that, you should join the application walkthroughs, which we'll talk about later. Some other differences in the Community Engaged Project Grant and the Make Art Grant from the other grant programs that you're going to hear about today. Oh, here's a date change that I missed, y'all. Is that in these two grant programs only, we do not do partial awards. You'll either receive the grant or you will not receive the grant. The second difference is that the grant program period is only 6 months. So unlike the other grant programs, if you receive the grant at April 3rd, it covers activity happening between July 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2023. And then for the second 6 months, that will be in our October deadline. And again, must be artist initiated or individual initiated outside of the support and structure of a nonprofit or other institutions. Todd, passing it back to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start talking about some of our organizational grants, and then my colleagues are going to follow up with other grants that organizations could apply to, whether they're a nonprofit or a fiscally sponsored organization. I'll talk more about what that means in a couple of slides. One thing we wanted to lead off for any of you who are associated with organizations interested in applying for grants is the SAM UEI requirement for organizations. So SAM UEI stands for Systems of Awards Management Universal Entity Indicator, and that is identifier, excuse me. And it is a number that the federal government requires nonprofit organizations receiving federally sourced funds to have in order to receive those funds. So you need to request one if you don't have one. If you don't have one, we recommend going after this workshop or as soon as possible to the sam.gov website and initiate the request process. This will become clearer when you do that process, but you just need the number. You don't need to register that number with sam.gov. There has been a lot of scamming happening with this process since it was rolled out by the federal government early in 2022. Just know that this process is free and you don't need to pay anything for it. Really just look towards whether or not you're on a .gov website when you do this. You should remain on those websites when you're doing this request process. If you're in a situation where you don't have a SAM UEI number by the April 3rd deadline, we can still accept your application. We will not be able to move your application to panel. So you will need to just be in touch with a program director who's managing the grant program you're applying to, letting them know if you don't have your SAM UEI number yet. They'll let you know what to do in the interim, and they'll also let you know when they will absolutely need it by. Otherwise, they'll have to pull your application from panel review, unfortunately. Again, this is not something that we're interested in enforcing. It's just a requirement of the federal government because our funds come from the federal government or match federal government funds. Next slide, please. Project grants for organizations. So this is the first of the grants that we're offering this cycle that organizations can apply to. It is our broadest in terms of what it funds, and we consider it our entry-level grant program. This grant, project grants for organizations, are for grants of up to $3,000 for any publicly engaged arts and culture program that contributes to the vitality of our communities, the economy of our state, the arts education of Rhode Islanders, and our quality of life. So again, very broad. In this program, we fund things such as festivals. Ones that come to mind we funded in the past are Oasis International's African Summer Bash, the Rhode Island Folk Festival's annual summer festival, events where thousands of people attend. We also, in the past in this program, have funded programs where it's a very intimate number of people, maybe a dozen people, queer archive works, open studio hours, etc. So there's a variety of things, again, we fund in this program, projects occurring around the state, obviously, as well. Next slide, please. So this program always has deadlines at both the April 3rd, so the April and October deadline every year. You have to be a nonprofit to apply. If you're not a nonprofit, but you're a group, you can apply if you have a nonprofit that functions as your fiscal sponsor. What this essentially means is that you have a nonprofit who is willing to submit an application on your behalf and is willing to take on the responsibility, at least to the state, of being like, hey, we'll be responsible to ensure that this project final report is filed, etc. I'll talk more about who can be a fiscal sponsor on a future slide and some more details there in case that's applicable to anyone. It used to be that this program required a cash match, meaning that for every dollar you were requesting from RISCA, you had to have a dollar coming from someplace else, meaning that if you were requesting $3,000, the total budget for your project had to be at least $6,000. And the other $3,000 you had to have, again, coming from someplace else, either identified or prospective. Now it doesn't matter, you can just apply for as much money as you need, up to $3,000 without a concern for that match requirement. Next slide, please. General operating support for organizations. I'll talk, like I said, more about the fiscal sponsorship question in a minute. The deadline for this program is once a year, it's April 3rd. If you were eligible to apply for this program at this deadline, you would have heard from me already. So just know that. So a lot of this is just FYI for those of you who are interested and thinking about it for the future. In order to be eligible, there's a series of eligibility requirements one has to meet. Being a nonprofit, being an arts and culture organization or a culturally specific organization. We have definitions as to what that means. You don't have to be a nonprofit. You can be a fiscally sponsored organization if your budget is $50,000 a year or less, your annual budget, I should say. The big thing to know for eligibility requirements, and this is why this slide occurs after the project grants for organizations slide, is that one of the requirements is having applied for and received high panel scores on 3 project grants for organizations or project grants and education grants in 3 consecutive years. If your organization fits our agency's definition of being BIPOC-centered, or your organization is based in an unrepresented town or municipality in the state of Rhode Island, then it's only 2 consecutive years of grants in either of those 2 categories, or high scoring applications in either of those 2 categories that you need. These grants are 3-year grants, and grant awards vary based on a funding formula. The funding formula takes into account the budget size of an organization, as well as panel scores and rankings, and whether or not the organization fits the definition of being BIPOC-centered. Next slide, please. Fiscal sponsorship. This is the slide I've been waiting for. So it used to be the case that, it's always been the case, at least in recent memory, that Organizations that were not nonprofits could apply for our project grants for organizations and other grant programs with a nonprofit as their fiscal sponsor. This change was made a few years ago that we've made it so any nonprofit can be one's fiscal sponsor. It used to be the case that if an organization was also applying for a grant from RISCA or was receiving general operating support grants from RISCA, they couldn't also be a fiscal sponsor. We've erased that requirement. So, there's organizations like AS220, for instance, that comes to mind, who do this a lot. They fiscally sponsor grants for entities who are not nonprofits so they can apply for things. They're in general operating support. They can now function as a fiscal sponsor for as many project grant applications as they choose. We understand that the whole issue of money going to a nonprofit, again, is a federal rule about what we can do with federally sourced funds. So just so you know, it's fairly open. I've had organizations use churches. I've had them use libraries, just really any kind of nonprofit they have a relationship with. It's understood that if you're using a fiscal sponsor, that fiscal sponsor might be a nonprofit whose mission is completely unrelated to whatever the project is you're doing. Again, this is just a legal requirement, and it's a workaround that we have in place that many state arts agencies have in place to allow our funds to touch as many communities as possible. And this change was made for a lot of reasons, one of them being equity reasons, right? The way in which being a nonprofit and the encumbrances entailed in that, certainly paperwork-wise, was precluding us from funding projects in rural communities and communities of color as well. Next slide, please.
Good morning again. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about project grants in education. So this is a long-standing grant program here at RISCA, but it's recently gone through a reorganization, as my colleagues have mentioned, to better align our funding to the rest of our strategic plan in terms of programmatic goals and servicing an incredibly comprehensive cross-section of learners here in the state. So the newly re-envisioned project grants in education is a funding category that provides project-specific support to schools, nonprofit organizations, individuals such as arts educators or teaching artists that engage students in rich and meaningful participatory arts learning. And so similar to my colleague Molly and her community engaged project grants, this is about two-way arts learning, art making, and education exchanges. These project grants in education should not substitute a school's arts education program. So this is not a grant category for schools looking to bring back arts experiences. This is to deepen the arts learning that's happening in a dedicated learning environment through additional participatory art making on the part of any group of distinct learners. Next slide, please. So here are the excuse me. Here are the newer, of course you get a frog in your throat when it's recorded, right? Here are the newer specifications for this grant program. So the deadlines happen twice a year at April 1st and October 1st, or 3rd and 2nd, as we've been discussing. These are grants for up to $10,000 for organizations or up to $3,000 for individual educators or teaching artists. Schools are eligible to apply. Nonprofit or fiscally sponsored organizations are eligible to apply. And again, individual arts educators or teaching artists who are in partnership with a dedicated learning environment may apply. The project must occur here in Rhode Island. For organizations who are requesting more than $3,000, this project category does have a match requirement. However, there are 3 instances where the match requirement can be waived. The first is if you're requesting less than $3,000. The second is if this is a pilot program and we are defining a pilot program as the 1st or 2nd year of the program. And the third is if you are a school or nonprofit organization who meets the state identified need criteria. That criteria is set by the Rhode Island Department of Education, and we've used their definition below. So it's either meeting the free or reduced lunch status, or based on the school's RIDE report card having a 2-star or less rating. Next slide, please. In order to qualify, your project must include 3 things. One is a drafted lesson plan with stated learning goals and intended outcomes. Different from previous years, this can be in whatever format you create and track your curriculum and make your own lesson plans and learning goals. We're not prescribing a certain lesson plan or template. The project must consist of a minimum of 8 contact hours between the same teaching artist and the same distinct group of learners. And those contact sessions must happen on separate days. This can look like an after school experience. This can look like an in-school day experience. It cannot look like an all school assembly. And the projects must consist of in-depth, sequential, and participatory art making and learning opportunities. The additional project requirements are that for in-school projects, the applicant has to be the school or the district and or the participating artist in partnership. For community-based projects, the organization where the nonprofit organization where the experience is occurring, the dedicated learning environment, they must be the applicant. Individuals cannot apply to work with a community-based organization in this project area. That's a CEPG. Individual applicants, you need to have a school identified already and a commitment letter as part of your application. An individual applicant must be at least 18 years of age or older. And an individual applicant cannot be actively enrolled in a degree program in an arts discipline or art-related subject area. Next slide, please. Anissa.
Hi, everybody. This is the Arts and Health Grants Program. This has also been newly restructured. So this is actually the first grant cycle with the new guidelines. And this is now open to nonprofit and fiscally sponsored organizations. If people are familiar with the previous Project Grants in Healthcare grant program, that was limited to healthcare organizations. And with our strategic plan and going through the restructure, we understand that health and well-being happen in many spaces, and we want to be able to provide arts and cultural grants to support arts and health in many spaces. This grant amount you can request is up to $9,000. You can ask for less than that. Also new is there's no cash match as in the past. So that has been removed. This grant program supports art programs and arts residencies with health-related goals that take place in health-based or community spaces. It funds both non-clinical arts engagements that promote and facilitate individual health and public arts activities that provide a public health benefit in Rhode Island and communities. The emphasis again is on a participatory arts program or artist residency, not a one-time event, and with an intended health or public health benefit. So the idea is that the participating artists, there's artists or an arts and cultural organization that's paired up with the nonprofit organization, and there is someone who's a subject matter expert. It used to be a healthcare professional, but it's not limited to that because we understand, depending on how the project is defined, that there is somebody who is a subject matter expert that is an advisor on this project. An example of a health project could be a senior center offers an interactive music program once a week over 6 months to stimulate memory and cognitive awareness for adults with Alzheimer's patients. You could also have a public health project, which might be a weekend arts intensive workshop for an opioid task force with follow-up visits by the workshop artists to help staff incorporate their learning in community health practice. You also see in our guidelines, we have a Rhode Island State Arts Health Plan with 5 priorities that are not, it's not mandatory that your project adheres to the 5 priorities, which is patient care, healing environments, caring for caregivers, education, and community well-being. But it's a way to guide you and help you think about your project and how you can best support the intended patients, individuals, and or staff or environments that you're working in. So for more information, I dropped the link in the chat. Next slide. Okay, as was mentioned earlier, we have other grant programs that are not open at this cycle. The Artist Open Studio Tours, Opportunity Grant, General Operating Support for Artists, Folk Arts Fellowship, and Folk Arts Apprenticeships. Those are all grant programs for individual artists. If you have questions about them, you can reach out to the program directors and also look at our website for more information about those to start planning ahead for the future. Next slide, please. The application process at RISCA. One of the things we suggest first is to read the grant guidelines, and we suggest you read them twice. We've been dropping them into the chat here. There's a lot of information, a lot of work has gone into these guidelines to put in information about what the intent of the specific grant program is, as well as the requirements that we're obligated by a state and federal funding agency. So there's a lot of information in there about, you know, the ins and outs of that. Once you read them and read them thoroughly and read them twice, we also ask you that you reach out to your program director or staff member. We are here to help you for sure. We want to help you along the way. We want to help your projects be successful, and we're here to answer questions. We don't give out any of the funding or make the funding decisions, so we are always here as a resource. If you're new to the process, and you haven't applied before, you need to create a profile on Foundant, which is our RISCA's online grant system. And it's pretty user-friendly, but again, we're also here to help you if you have any issues. If you have already applied before and you have any issues with your login, also reach out to us. We're happy to help you get set back up. The next thing is you would write your application, gather support materials, either on the website in the guidelines that we've dropped in the chat, or in the Foundant online portal. You can download questions as a PDF. You can work as a Word document, you know, whatever your style is, you can save and, you know, refer back to it. You can also work as a draft in the system. So there's many ways you can do that. And then you want to hit the submit button before the deadline, as we will reinforce later, not like 2 minutes to the deadline. Like, you want to do it well in advance. Tech glitches happen all the time. And also, if you do it far in advance, you also have an opportunity to check back in with us about your application. And then you wait. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of the review and notification process, because just there is a long period of applying and then before you would hear. As applications come in, the staff reviews all the applications for eligibility and completeness. If you do submit far enough in advance, you have the opportunity that we can review. And if there's something that is needs to be fixed, we can reset it back to draft. As Todd was saying, you know, like with your SAM UEI number, or there might be some other things that maybe you didn't upload correctly. We have the opportunity, you can fix them if it is well in advance of the deadline. If it is the day of the deadline, 2 days before the deadline, we are really busy and there's no guarantees. Once you hit submit and the deadline passes, there are no changes whatsoever. So then once it's the April 3rd deadline has passed, panelists will review the applications and recommend funding. They will meet together on a panel review day and go through the grants, and there'll be more detail about how that process happens in a little bit. From that panel review day, the staff will write up panel notes based on the comments from the panelists to provide to all the applicants, whether you receive an award or not. The council reviews the panel recommendations, and they will be meeting for this grant cycle in June. So just to give you a heads up about what the timeline is, they will be meeting in June to make the final decisions about the awards. And then after that, we can notify you whether you got the award or not. So again, we're talking about June for this April 3rd deadline. Then after that, we will mail you a check. Although we will not mail you a check, RISCA does not actually have any control of the checks. Unfortunately, we wish we could get them out sooner, but it is going through the state system, and it takes about 8 to 12 weeks after you submit everything, which we'll go into in a little detail in the next slide. And then after that, you do your project, and then you tell us about how it was. There's reporting back for the federal funding, as well as just the impact. We want to know what's going on with your project. Next slide. So after you get the grant, this is really important just to understand, again, the details in the process is there'll be a lot of instructions in your award email about what you need to follow and the obligations that you have for receiving a RISCA award. And you will fill out your grant agreement and you will register with the Ocean State Procures. So filling out your grant agreement will tell us whether you want your award or not. And the Ocean State Procures is the state system, not run by RISCA, which is a mandatory process to become an approved vendor with the state. If people have gotten awards in the past, this system is new in the last few years. You may have to update in the system. And again, they approve everything and nothing, no invoices can be submitted until you are an approved vendor. And then from that point, it could be 60 to 90 days for the check. And again, we are here to help you and support you, but they are state systems that are out of our control, unfortunately. And so we can't send any money until those things are done. If you have any questions about your panel comments, you can reach out to your program director. We are happy to talk about them with you. And you can also communicate with your program director if there's any changes to your project along the way. And you can also let us know what's happening. You know, we don't guarantee that we'll put things out on our social media platforms, but we are definitely interested in staying in touch and hearing what's happening. And so as Faye shared earlier, she is here as well as a resource. And we also invite you to ask questions. We are always here as a resource for you all throughout the year. Next slide. If you don't get the grant, we're here to support you. We really want to provide the resources and access. We're really excited about what's happening in the state, and we invite you to ask your program director to review the panel comments for more feedback. You know, we want to help you write a better application, whether connect you with other resources, whether to think about your timeline, you know, just thinking about your project. We want you all to succeed, so that's what we're here for. And we will start having meetings about the next grant deadline as soon as grants open. Next slide. And a note on partial funding. As Molly mentioned earlier, many of the grants, with the exception of one of her programs, you might receive partial funding. It really varies by program. And if you receive partial funding, we don't expect you to do the project as you stated in your application. We understand that you might have to make modifications and change it and scale it back. We do expect that you will keep it within the spirit of what you proposed, because that's what the panelists reviewed and awarded. But if you have any questions, you can just ask us and talk about that. But again, we expect that you might have to modify it. You can also decide to decline the grant with no penalties. You know, if you decide you really can't do this project with the funds that were awarded to you, or circumstances changed for whatever reason, that also happens, you can decline the grant. There's just no issues. You can apply again. It doesn't matter. And we also sometimes do partial funding because we wish we had more money to give out just in general for all the projects we would like to support. But we have limited resources, and we also want to ensure that funds are distributed across the state for the programs. And so that is another reason why partial funding may happen. So next slide. Panelists, I think this is Molly. Am I tossing?
No, this is me. This is me.
Oh, Maggie. All right.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Anissa. So briefly, as Lynn mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, the RISCA staff is here to support the applicant and to prepare the panelists for review. So we don't have any input into the funding recommendations. And so in the spirit of transparency, we want to tell you about how the panelists are prepared and what you can anticipate when your application is being reviewed. So it's important to note that the panel makeup is going to be a little bit different for each program, but for the majority of the programs, there'll be 5 panelists for each panel. They're primarily Rhode Island residents, and they're always content area experts as applicable, with deep involvement in the arts and culture sector. The RISCA staff is committed also, as Lynn mentioned, to diversity and all that entails, diversity in many forms. So we assemble the panel beholden to that. Panels are different every single grant cycle. Decisions vary based on the composition of panels because of everything listed above. And again, we are not involved in any funding decisions at all. Next slide, please. So panelists are invited and selected by RISCA staff to serve. The panelists receive the exact same grant guidelines and training packet that you'll get as an applicant. So at the bottom of each grant has its own dedicated webpage. And at the bottom of that webpage, you'll see a bunch of PDF materials. It's a question list, guidelines, and a rubric. Those documents that the applicant gets are the exact same documents that the panelists receive to be trained. The panelists receive the applications via the same online grant system that you'll use to apply, so they're in the same system to review. We say, we give the panelists about 3 to 4 weeks leading up to their actual panel to do a pre-score and review. We like to say that each panelist spends about 30 minutes per application reviewing the materials, and we ask our panelists to review between 20 and 35 applications altogether. Once the pre-scoring is set, there is a panel day for each grant, and panelists meet for an all-day in-person or sometimes Zoom review session. There are discussions about each application and an opportunity to rescore. The total or average scores are tabulated at the end of that day, and then that information is presented to the panelists, and they use those rankings from their combined scores to make funding recommendations. Next slide, please. Molly.
All right, y'all, I'm just going to take a brief pause at this moment and see if anybody has any questions before we jump into the here are recommendations and best practices on grant writing. So I feel like it's a small enough group. If you need to unmute and just ask or drop in the chat, I'll just pause for a minute. Jim, I see you've unmuted yourself. Go for it.
Hi, thank you. Can one apply for the Ocean State Procures any time of the year, just for the future? Does it, with or without a grant award?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, Damon, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. I just have a quick, not really a question, I have a comment on that, because I got the, I think it was a small business grant that, but also goes through state procures. It's not like they process it and then it sits in a queue for 8 months, 8 weeks, and then they cut it. It's more like, as soon as they finish processing it, it goes right out, they get cut. Because I remember I had a lot of problems with my SAM, getting my SAM. There was some weird stuff that happened, and they just, I guess it just said try to get your information cleared with procures as soon as you can, because that will hold up everything else. But once they actually get to process it, it doesn't take long to get the check, but they can't actually work on it until everything is in line. So I think I had a double combination of, for that, I needed an EIN number and the SAMS number, and it was complicated, but they're great to work with. It wasn't a problem. It was just I just have to get all the government stuff out of the way and make sure everything's lined up, and then it's quick. So it shouldn't discourage anyone from applying for it because of the timeline.
And I will say that for our grants, individuals applying to things like Community Engaged Project Grant or the Make Art Grant do not need to do SAM.gov or UEI registration. It's just the OSP. For other agencies like Commerce, those small business grants, you do. And there's some questions in the chat that I'll just read. If my organization is eligible for more than one grant for the same project, can I apply for multiple grants? No, you can only for each project you can apply for one grant. But if you have, if you're an individual artist and you're doing really cool workshops at the library with youth where they're making stuff out of recycled materials, and you also are a video artist making your own work completely separately from that, you can apply for a community engaged project grant and a Make Art grant, but they have to be completely separate projects. Does that make sense? Great. And then cash match.
I can take that really quick.
Oh, Maggie.
Yeah. So in terms of this cycle, the only cash match grant is the education grant. And just to clarify that again, if you are an organization, individuals never have to come up with the cash match. If you are an organization asking for more than $3,000, so 3,001 to 10, then you do have to show that your organization can match. And it does have to, it's not in kind, it's cash. So, but typically, especially when schools are the applicant, the operational expenses that are already occurring for the project, such as the classroom teachers' time, salary and time, more than make up that cash match. And those are the kinds of things that I can work with you on your budget while you're applying. And I think that, Molly, I will offer to monitor these questions that are happening in the chat if we want to move on with the presentation at this point.
Yeah, will you answer Nick's question before we
gonna
move on?
answer-
Because I think
yep.
it's super valuable. Perfect. Okay, so Maggie's gonna answer Nick's question in the chat, which is an excellent question. Thank you for that. So now we're gonna go through grant writing best practices, tips, and tricks. You'll see a theme. So the first piece is, what if I am late? And nope is really giant on this slide for a reason. And it's because we can't have any exceptions to late applications. We open them for 2 months. We give ample support, as we'll talk about. You all are here, so we have grant application support. And like Anissa mentioned earlier, tech glitches happen. Stuff happens at the last minute. Please don't wait for the last minute. Reminder that we go home, and I put that in quotes because I think all 4 of us are sitting at home right now, right? We're still partially working remotely. So we leave our jobs for the day around 5 p.m. on the deadline day. We will not be waiting up to help you until 11:59 p.m. I know a couple of us usually stay up kind of late on deadline day to do our best to answer questions, but don't count on that. And I won't tell you which PDs do that, just so you don't count on that. And then I'll also say that the application portal closes at 11:59 p.m., not 11:59 p.m. and 1 second. So this is what I mean by don't wait for the last second, because once it flips over to 11:59 p.m., it's just closed, nothing, and that's automatic. So if you're hitting submit at the last minute, do it by at least 11:50, y'all. Yes. Okay, grant writing tips. Thoroughly read and follow the directions. So when I first started at RISCA, which was 6 years ago now, I was like a little bit shocked in my first grant cycle to see all of the creative and amazing ways folks can find to not follow the directions. And it's about 50% of the applications that we see will not have thoroughly read and followed the directions. And I thought to myself, I was like, all right, well, the population that I'm supporting are individual artists. None of them are professional grant writers. Like it's a little weird. And then I asked some other funders, and I'll say all that 50% number, not about artists. It's 100% just about grant applications. Like people who are doing multi-million-dollar grants to hospitals, 50% don't thoroughly read and follow the directions. So if there's one thing you can take away from this grant writing workshop, is that if you do this one seemingly easy step, you'll already be better off than 50% of the other people applying for that grant. And this goes for all grants across the board. So I will just say that like all of the questions are there for a reason. We've given thorough directions. If you don't understand something, please reach out to us. But the easiest way to do things is just to thoroughly read and follow the directions. And here's all the other stuff that's just gravy, right? Be excited about your project. the panelists will be excited about your project, right? As Maggie mentioned, all of the panelists are working in arts and culture in some way and value arts and culture as vital and value artists and culture bearers as important. They're already on that page. They want to fund cool stuff. If you don't think your stuff is cool, they won't either. So remember to like be positive. Address the grant application questions directly and fully. And you'll see a lot of thoroughly read and follow the directions written here in other ways, including this. So the grant application questions, particularly since we've all overhauled our grant programs, are really carefully written and they match up with the review criteria. So look at what the questions are asking and the sub questions and really answer those, because that will help you meet the review criteria. We also recommend to have an outsider read your application. The panel won't know your project, probably, and might not know your art form. So we only have 5 panelists, sometimes only 3. So if you're a printmaker, there may not be a printmaker on the panel. There will probably be somebody with an expertise in visual arts. It might not be a printmaker, it might not be a choreographer. So just remember that you are writing for an audience that understands the arts and the value of the arts, but you may not be writing for somebody that understands the details of your project. So we recommend to have an outsider. This does not mean the person who has been working on the project with you for 3 years, or your studio neighbor that's been hearing you talk about it. It means somebody that like isn't already deeply familiar with the project. You want to make sure you can see the forest in the grant application, not just the trees, or like a super zoomed in picture of the bark, right? You want the bigger picture of the why. Which transitions us nicely to the next one. Fully address the why of the project. We're an arts vendor. We care about some of the squishy stuff. We care about the outcomes for the artists and for the people participating in these art projects. We don't just care about numbers. We care about why you're doing this. And then as a reminder, it's already been mentioned, we have evaluation rubrics for all of these grant programs. They're the exact same rubrics that the panelists will use to review. Please look at them as you're writing your application. Don't wait for the last minute. And this isn't just about hitting submit. This is about asking any questions. This is about gathering support materials. This is all of those things, just making sure that you're able to complete some of the pieces of grant applications that might take longer. Like if you really want a letter of support from someone, probably don't ask them on the deadline day, ask them a couple weeks ahead. Communicate with your program staffer. It's literally our job to help you. And if you think you have a dumb question, I can tell you 2 things. It's not a dumb question, and somebody else has already asked us, maybe even that day, right? We're here to help you. We've got a lot of resources. We can also, because we don't make any funding decisions in our jobs, we're not allowed to have opinions, right? Which is kind of great, because we can give you feedback on your application. Probably not if you send it to us the day of the deadline or, just a couple days before the deadline. At this point, I haven't seen any applications asking for feedback yet. I'll probably start to see them this week or next week, and then it'll pick up pace. I don't know how other folks are, but probably about the same. And image submissions. Here's another follow the directions. We tell you file size and format. Naming is more open in many of the grant programs, but follow the directions, particularly on file size and format for everything, because our grant system just won't read a lot of file formats, and file size is bigger than a certain size. So your support material, whatever you upload, just will not appear for the panelists or for us. Reminder that panelists are looking at your application on their computers at home. And so if you have really complex artwork, maybe include detail shots. This is really for visual artists. If the work is large in scale or dimensional, include an installation shot so folks can get an idea of what it looks like in the space that it's meant to be viewed in. And I'm going to hand it over to Todd.
Thank you, Molly. So many, if not all, of our grant programs require that you submit support materials as part of that. That's things that outside the narrative that address the project itself that you might be applying for a grant for, as well as particularly for many of our grant programs, what support from the community you have for that. So they help us tell the story of the work, your project or organization. Remembering your audience, remember there's panelists that are reviewing these applications. They're reviewing a lot of them when they sit and read those things. So I'll talk about kinds of support materials in the next slide, but you'll just want to be sure to curate them to ensure that you're not giving them too much. And again, I'll talk more about what too much is on the next slide. And you'll want to think about how these relate back to the review criteria. Again, many of our grant programs have an explicit component to them about community connection, whether the community be an identified community geographically or a community within a school or a healthcare situation. But as an entity granting out state and federal funds from taxpayers, the ultimate end user for anything that we support is the people of Rhode Island. Having that voice and that kind of support.
Todd, you're having some audio freezing.
I'll take over for Todd because we're not hearing you at all. Sorry, dude.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, relate back to the review criteria. I think that he covered that pretty well. Again, the things that we're asking for are really specific, and they're specific for a reason. Examples of support materials. So for each application, it varies, I think, between 5 and 10 support materials that you're allowed to submit. Things we see really frequently are letters of support from community members. This is particularly meaningful, as Todd was talking about, for really communities, to really show the community connections and the value of the project. Resumes or CVs of the artists or arts administrators or teachers involved. Images or video of the work, right? Remember, we're an arts funder. The panelists want to see some of the art. And this includes, you know, like, we're going to get excited about kids making art. We're not talking about highlighting the most highest excellent quality unless you're applying for a Make Art grant. Press. So if you've had past reviews or newspaper articles, particularly for previous iterations of the same program or things that are related, that's always really exciting to see. Marketing collateral, and then lists of quotes. This can be just like, for in an education setting, quotes from parents and caregivers or students, depending on their age, about how the program has helped them, about the quality of the teaching artist or the artists involved, sort of that idea. Anissa or Todd or Maggie, do you want to share any other examples of support materials?
Sure. Some of the things that education specifically will ask, especially of our individual applicants, are letters of partnership showing that the school or the district is on board. And then in education, if you do qualify for a match waiver because you meet the state need criteria, you'll need to upload evidence of that as well. And student testimonials can't say enough about the impact of students speaking about their experience in your program.
And also for arts and health, testimonials are important. Background about the subject matter expert or health professional is important. And then in relation to defining the health benefit is you might upload rubrics or some form of assessment. Doesn't have to be super complicated, but just some form of measurement that you plan to use.
All right, I'm going to toss it to Maggie to talk about artistic merit.
So as we mentioned multiple times here, we are re-granting federal funds from the National Endowment for the Arts. The endowment requires an evaluation of artistic excellence and merit in all of their re-granting. But what RISCA wants to clarify is that artistic excellence and merit is measured against artistic vibrancy and relevancy, or a similar criteria that's listed in each grant program's rubric. So again, Those rubrics are publicly available for the applicant and to train the panelists. Some examples of the way that RISCA measures artistic merit and excellence on their rubrics in the GOSO program. You'll see that under the category of artistic vibrancy and relevancy. In the arts and health program, you'll see artistic engagement and relevancy. In project grants and education, you'll see that artistic excellence is a measurement of the arts learning and not a qualification of the teaching artist's resume or CV. Molly, if you want to stop sharing, I'm gonna share now. So we're gonna, we have an
We're gonna skip the budget video, actually.
Okay, there we go.
Because we're running out of time, but Anissa has dropped the budget video in the chat, and additionally, we have a YouTube playlist of the grant support videos, which this video, once we get it uploaded, will go in that YouTube playlist. The budget video is already there. Past grant workshops are already there. You can find that YouTube playlist in the blog post that I just posted, but I highly recommend watching the budget video. It's wonderful. All right, need more help. So we, in addition to this grant workshop, we also, all four of us have program-specific application walkthroughs where we'll walk through the application question by question, talk about those. Those will be longer and have much more time for a more interactive question and answer. Please sign up for those. Drop-in office hours for all programs. So we have a couple of drop-in office hours. Ooh, we don't have drop-in office hours. We forgot to update that slide. So we're not doing drop-in office hours this cycle. We do have lots of one-on-one meetings. And again, I'll refer you back to the blog post that I put in the chat that has, and that Anissa just dropped in the chat as well, that has links to sign up or instructions to sign up for one-on-one meetings with all of us. So we have availability. Again, it gets a little tight the closer you get to the deadline. And then last minute drop-in office hours. So the day of the deadline, April 3rd, as well as the Friday before, which I believe would be March 31st. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Educator Maggie, for knowing that. We will have open drop-in office hours on Zoom from likely 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., maybe a little bit longer, I don't remember. But those are basically open Zoom office hours. One of the four of us will be on Zoom for the whole day. We rotate for all of your last minute questions. Again, those do not go up until 11:59 p.m. But if you're like getting really close and just have one quick question, know that those 2 days, one of the four of us will be in a Zoom room ready to answer your last minute panic questions, right? We got you. Other ways to get help are, we hope that you'll join our Facebook resource groups, Arts Administrators of Rhode Island and Artists and Creatives of Rhode Island. And then also we have some posts on the some links to the RISCA website. Again, Anissa is dropping these all into the chat, where you can look at arts jobs in Rhode Island that we know about, calls for art, and then our grants page, which has all of the grants. And I know that we are a little bit past time, so I'll ask Maggie to stop recording and say thank you all for coming. We'll all hang out for maybe 5 more minutes if you have questions, but feel free to drop off if you need